This lecture is on environmental health, oft overlooked area of uh, manufacturing and agricultural products. So here we have the Monterey County Health Department Environmental Health Bureau Hazardous Materials Management Service. So here in Monterey County, we have our Monterey County Health Department, and they are responsible for all kinds of different things. And you'd be surprised at how much responsibility they have from all of our drinking water and agricultural services and even certain legal issues. In the past, a friend of mine, Eileen Woodbury, was in charge of hazardous materials management, and she is now off as an independent private consultant, does a lot of trainings in hazmat and hazardous training. She's an excellent expert in this area, but she's no longer with our local Monterey County Environmental Health. Anyway, so what are we going to talk about here? We'll talk about compliance programs. We'll talk about emergency response issues and enforcement from the county, because the county is a civil law enforcement, and in some cases they get involved in certain criminal law enforcement as well, when they turn it over to the district attorney and get the police involved or sheriff involved. But primarily they're enforcement at the civil level for regulatory compliance of these issues. We'll also talk about cooler inspections. So you start to see the tie-in. Why are we talking about this in this class? Well, this is one area. They do walkthroughs and take pictures, look at your records, look at your business response and contingency plans, which we'll talk about later. They'll give tips to the people for inspections, and they'll provide some of those tips here. And also the CalARP RMP compliance, your risk management plan. So that's the agenda. So what about compliance programs? There's a hazardous materials management plan. And if you're in agriculture, you have hazardous materials. One of the most significant hazardous materials is the ammonia, the anhydrous ammonia used in refrigeration systems. But there are lots of other things, major flammables like diesel oils for operating your tractors and equipment, pesticides, and quite a number of other things that may or may not fall under the Bureau, the Monterey County Health Bureau responsibility. It depends on certain factors, but they can find themselves involved in a lot of different hazardous material areas, even though technically they're more responsible for those things that are significant dangers for release to either the public health directly or through explosive hazards, things like that. So there's something called a business response plan. In my day, it was called the emergency response plan, and it's been changed. It's not just in case of emergency that you worry about it. You have a business response plan because it's something that's seen as being part of normal business operations. Yes, an emergency could happen and you need to be ready, but the idea that you have an emergency response plan, I think they changed the wording to make it more day-to-day operations with emergency planning as part of that. There's also hazardous waste management. What do you do to get rid of things? So you have materials on site that you're not trying to throw away. What is your plan if something goes wrong? What if you're trying to get rid of those materials? So with the compliance programs, they have all kinds of different areas that they look at, underground storage, above ground storage. These could be filled with gasoline, diesel, certain other kinds of oils, and other types of storage tanks. And they're looking at what is your response plan if something goes wrong? What if there's a fire? What if there's a leak? What do you do? You have to have that figured out before there's a problem. Also, they're looking at spill prevention and control measures. You can see there is a stem wall surrounding these tanks. So if there is a leak, it will be caught in this essentially a mini swimming pool kind of a structure underneath that will capture the material so it doesn't just spread and flow into adjacent areas, soak into the ground, etc. Accidental release prevention. I believe this is a photo of a refinery. So they take crude oil and turn it into everything from compressed gases like your propane tanks to gasoline and oils, diesel, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But you need a risk management plan, which is a little different than your business response plan. You could think of them as levels. Virtually every company triggers a business response plan. Every company needs to know what is our emergency response if we have a problem. What are we going to do? And so that's your business response plan. But if you have certain things like a refinery would, a ton of hazardous and explosive materials when you're turning crude oil into gasoline and diesel and everything else, that's really dangerous. Or if you are a cooling facility and you've got tens of thousands of pounds of anhydrous ammonia in your tanks, you have another level and you trigger what's called your risk management plan. And so you can learn from the county at what levels do you need a risk management plan. I worked for a strawberry company, a relatively modest sized strawberry company in Watsonville, Santa Cruz areas. And one of the first tasks I was given is creating the RMP, ERP at the time. It was called the Risk Management Plan, Emergency Response Plan. Now it's the Risk Management Plan, Business Response Plan. Same things. Together, they took up about 8 inches on the shelf, a solid 8 inches of papers. It was including who to call, how you would get people to the doctor, emergency numbers, maps of the area, of all of the different site locations, on and on, detail that you would be surprised at. A lot of that can be done through cookie cutter templates, so you don't have to manually type all of that material, but you have to complete page after page after page of information so that you know what you're doing. And then you have to turn that into training and train your employees appropriately on the things they need to know. And you need to make sure you keep it up to date so that, you know, who is the emergency responder if you have a leak of anhydrous ammonia in your facility. Another program, site mitigation and cleanup. What happens after there's a problem? How do you mitigate or reduce the spread or the overall damages? How do you contain a problem when there is a spill? Maybe there's a truck that rolls over off the freeway and rolls down into a creek and all that diesel starts pouring out of the tanks into the creek. You got a problem. You got to clean it up. You got to do what you can to minimize damage and then clean up as much as you can afterwards. It's never perfect in something like that. Crash in a creek is really an unfortunate situation, not just for the person who crashed, but for the mitigation and cleanup efforts after the fact. And there are specific programs, rules, processes for doing that. So the emergency response program is a 24/7, 365-day program. It's always on, period. There is never a second when Monterey County doesn't have their emergency response team fully staffed. And so when there is a diesel spill due to an accident on the freeway, or there's an agricultural release, a spill at a fertilizer facility, or there's a release of anhydrous ammonia at a cooling facility, they're ready. Now, Monterey County programs in their Environmental Health Bureau does have first responder agency status. And so whoever's on site first, the responsibility, whether it's Monterey County, whether it's the fire department, whether it's the sheriff's office, somebody's going to get there first. And first thing you do, block off the area. Nobody goes in unless they're authorized as part of the emergency response team. The health department, their primary role is to assess what's going on. What are the hazards? Is it a chemical hazard? Is it a biological hazard? What are the risks? And determine essentially when the site is clean enough to allow reentry by the public. They're the ones who give the green light or the red light to say, nope, it's not ready, nobody's coming in. And nobody goes in who's not part of the emergency response team. Nobody goes in until the Environmental Health Department says so. Lots of things can happen, industrial chemical releases. So they have to get all suited up in their hazmat material, fully protected with boots and chemical resistant suits, et cetera, et cetera. Highway accidents and spills, I've already mentioned those. When that happens, there's the immediate tragedy of the crash itself, but then you have the cleanup. Not every accident is necessarily going to be a spill, but many of them are, because at the very least you have those diesel tanks, and that triggers an Environmental Health Bureau response. But what's in the other parts of the vehicle? What were they transporting? So maybe it's just diesel, maybe the container on the truck was bringing some other hazardous material along. And so now you've got something else. You've got a whole container full of gasoline. You've got a whole container filled with some industrial chemical, whatever it is. So they have to do their chemistry. They have to assess the hazards. Here's a fully suited operator. They have these scuba style air supply tanks rather than just a simple respirator. And that's for first response. They can reduce the level of hazmat gear if they determine that there is nothing hazardous, and maybe reduce it to not requiring supplemental oxygen for breathing. But as they're assessing it, they've got to figure out what's going on, and they have to go through their chemical analyses, and the data will then determine what actions they need to take. A lot of people don't think about it, but clandestine drug laboratories, a lot of meth labs and other types of street drugs are manufactured. Meth is one of the more, I guess, famous one for clandestine drug labs, just because it is so hazardous to manufacture and it creates a real problem. Other things, manufacturing LSD or something like that, there are minor hazards associated with that compared to making methamphetamine. And so meth is really high on the list of the clandestine drug operation. Once they find them, then they've got the problem of how the hell do they clean that up safely? They are extreme explosive hazards as well as chemical exposure hazards at these drug lab sites. And there have been many stories of them in and around Monterey County, throughout California in general. They often have dump sites where you'll find very hazardous materials that have been dumped by the drug lab operators. And this presents an additional cleanup and environmental and public nuisance hazards. Some of the materials thrown out can be extremely dangerous. Bioterrorism falls underneath the umbrella of activities. Now, hopefully that's not something that happens too often, but it certainly can. The FBI is always contacted if there is a bioterrorism incident, but who would be the hazmat, the hazardous materials responders? If it happened within Monterey County, it would be our Environmental Health Bureau emergency response team in almost every case, unless it was something highly, highly unusual. Now they've got Senator Leahy. This was a classic story. You can look this one up, but this was when some powder was sent to one of the senators. And I believe, was that anthrax? Anyway, it's a blur of horror stories. They have their bioterrorism lab where they can work on these things, identify what's in there. Sewer spills. Again, you need to do everything in your power to avoid spills going into the sewer in the first place. So you have special containment structures. One of the facilities where I used to take students in the past, they had these rolling paved areas that, like, at first one of the students like, why do they have this? It's like you're going up and then down and up and then down. And they were like basically little mini swimming pools. And so as you're driving through this maze of the parking structure, if there was a spill, it would be contained. It wouldn't flow out into the streets and down into the sewers. And there are other things. If you have a sewer nearby, there are sewer covers you can get to minimize or stop the flow of a spill from going into the sewer while you're trying to do the cleanup efforts. But you don't do the cleanup yourself. You spill something, you call the right team. You need to know how to deal with whatever you're handling. You spill your coffee, you clean it up. You spill hazardous materials, you call in the experts. You do not want to have a secondary problem because now you are on fire or you have just poisoned yourself because you're cleaning up something that you don't know how to do safely. So let's take a short break.